Hi, friends, and welcome back to Kari's Confessions, a nonprofit exec tells all. I'm Kari Anderson, principal with Incite Consulting, where I spend most of my days helping nonprofits build stronger boards, healthier organizations, and funding models that actually support the mission instead of exhausting the people doing the work, like you. I spent 25 plus years in the nonprofit sector and leadership roles with 7 organizations, and now I provide coaching and consulting services to ensure that nonprofits like yours have the structure, systems, and practices to do your best work. Wherever I go, I continue to hear that nonprofit execs need a space to gather, to receive tools, feedback, and advice that encourages them to stay the course. It doesn't matter if you're in a village of 182 or a metropolis of millions, nonprofit work is both gratifying and lonely. I'm here to make sure that you breathe, laugh, smirk, and get excited again about the important work that you do. If you've been around nonprofits for any length of time, you've probably discovered something. Most of us don't get into this work because it's easy. We get into it because we care. Sometimes maybe a little too much. Today, we're talking about something that I see in almost all nonprofits I work with, from organizations with 2 staff members to organizations with 200. Burnout. But maybe not in the way that you're expecting. So I don't actually think burnout is the biggest problem. I think burnout is the symptom. The real issue? Ownership. What happens when people stop feeling like they have any control over their work? What happens when everyone is busy but no one feels successful? What happens when incredibly talented people spend more time reacting than leading? So today, we're going to talk about how organizations move from burnout to ownership. And I promise you, this isn't just another conversation about self-care. It's a conversation about leadership. So, in my opinion, in this sector, we have somehow made chaos feel normal. I was facilitating a board retreat a few months ago. During a break, one of the staff members pulled me aside. She looked absolutely exhausted, as most of us do. She said, "Kari, I don't even know what my job is anymore." Now, this wasn't someone who lacked talent. She was exceptional. She cared deeply about the mission. She worked late. She volunteered for extra projects. She was exactly the kind of employee every executive director hopes to hire. So I asked her, "What changed?" She laughed, not because it was funny, because it was familiar. She said, "Every Monday, our priorities are different than what they were on Friday. We're constantly chasing the newest emergency. Nobody says no to anything. I feel like I'm failing, even though I never stop working." That conversation has stayed with me because I've heard versions of it hundreds of times. Different organizations, different states, different missions. Exactly the same story. Here's the thing. She wasn't burned out because she worked hard. She was burned out because she couldn't see progress. There's a huge difference. People can work incredibly hard when they know what they're building, but people become exhausted when they're digging holes that get filled back in every single night. So burnout isn't usually a people problem. One of the phrases I hear most often from nonprofit leaders is, "My staff just needs to be more resilient." I understand why people say that. Leadership is hard. Funding is uncertain. Community needs keep growing. Board expectations can feel impossible. You start looking for something that you can control. So resilience becomes the answer. But here's what I've learned after working with more than 1,000 nonprofits across the country. Burnout is usually a systems problem. Wearing a people costume. Think about that for a second. We blame people, but when it's actually the systems that are actually exhausting them. So imagine asking someone to assemble a 1,000-piece puzzle without showing them the picture on the box. Then every 15 minutes, you swap out 50 pieces. Eventually, they don't become less capable. They become frustrated. That's exactly what happens inside nonprofits. Priorities change. Roles overlap. Nobody knows who owns what. One person becomes the keeper of all institutional knowledge. The board asks for new initiatives. Funders add another reporting requirement. A community crisis emerges. Before long, Everyone is sprinting and no one knows what the finish line is. So I'd like to bust one of my favorite nonprofit myths, if that's okay. Here it is. Nonprofits aren't businesses. Yes, they are. They're absolutely businesses. They're simply businesses with a different tax status. That distinction matters because I've watched organizations unintentionally use the word nonprofit as permission not to build business systems. We're a nonprofit, as if that explains why there's no operating plan. We're a nonprofit, as if that explains why fundraising lives entirely inside one person's head. We're a nonprofit, as if that explains why no one knows who's making decisions. Friends, the IRS does not require chaos. The IRS simply gives you a tax designation. That's it. You still need revenue, and frankly, lots of it. You still need leadership. You still need strategy. You still need systems. You still need accountability. When leaders embrace that mindset, something wonderful happens. Conversations become less emotional. Instead of asking who's to blame, we start asking what system needs to improve. That's a completely different conversation. So I'm going to share a favorite client story with you. I worked with an organization a while back that was convinced they had a staffing problem. Turnover was high. People looked exhausted. Morale was low. The executive director assumed they needed more employees. So before we talked about hiring, I asked one question. What are your organization's top 3 priorities this quarter? Silence. So first, the executive director answered. Then the board chair gave 3 different priorities. And the development director had yet another list. The program manager had another. The finance director had another. 5 leaders, 5 different organizations, except they all work for the same nonprofit. No wonder everyone felt overwhelmed. Every day, they were making decisions based on different scorecards. Hiring another employee wouldn't have fixed that. Clarity fixed it. We spent one afternoon agreeing on 3 organizational priorities. 3, not 30, 3. Then we started asking a simple question before every new project. Which priority does this support? If the answer wasn't clear, it waited. Within about 3 months, staff weren't actually working fewer hours, but they were sleeping better because they finally knew what winning looked like. So if you want ownership, you've got to give people something to own. That starts with clarity, not motivation, not inspirational posters, clarity. When I began consulting with a new organization, one of my favorite questions is incredibly simple. What does success look like? You would be amazed how many people give different answers. The executive director has one vision. The board has another. The staff have another. It's like watching 5 people trying to row the same boat, except for they're all rowing towards different shorelines. No amount of effort fixes that. Alignment does. One of the healthiest phrases a leader can say is this: we can't do everything, period. I know, it sounds obvious, and yet nonprofits struggle with it more than almost any sector because every opportunity feels mission aligned. Every grant seems important. Every partnership sounds exciting. Every community request feels urgent. But here's what I tell clients all the time. Every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. The question is whether you're choosing intentionally or accidentally. Leadership is stewardship. Sometimes stewardship means protecting your people from too much opportunity. I want you to think about one question. If I walked into your organization tomorrow and asked every employee, what are the 3 most important things this organization is trying to accomplish over the next 90 days, would their answers match? Or would they all give me something different? Because if they don't know, they can't own it. And ownership, not hustle, is what creates healthy organizations. So I shared a little about why burnout really isn't a people problem. It's usually a systems problem. Talked about clarity, priorities, and why ownership begins with helping people understand what success actually looks like. I want to keep pulling on that thread because once you've created clarity, there are a few more ingredients that transform an organization from simply surviving to truly thriving. Let's start with one that makes almost everyone uncomfortable: hard conversations. Hard conversations are frankly one of the kindest things you'll ever do. Years ago, I had an executive director call me after one of our coaching sessions. He said, "Kari, I know I need to talk with one of my managers, but I don't want to hurt their feelings." I asked, "How long have you known this conversation needed to happen?" He paused, then quietly answered, about 8 months. 8 months. Think about that. For 8 months, he had been carrying frustration. For 8 months, the employee had unknowingly continued the same behavior. For 8 months, the rest of the team had watched it happen. Nobody won. That's what avoiding conflict does. It doesn't eliminate discomfort, it simply spreads it around the organization. One person begins carrying extra work, someone else becomes resentful. The strongest performers quietly wonder why expectations seem optional. Eventually, people begin telling stories in the hallway instead of having conversations in the office. And hallway conversations have never solved an organizational problem, not once. So, a few years ago, I was coaching an executive director who had convinced herself that one employee simply didn't care. She was frustrated. The board was frustrated. Everyone assumed the employee lacked commitment. Finally, after months of avoiding it, we had the conversation. She sat down with the employee and simply said, "Help me understand what I'm seeing." The employee burst into tears, not because she'd been caught doing something wrong, because her husband had been diagnosed with cancer 6 months earlier. She'd been trying to keep everything together without asking for help. The executive director had interpreted silence as disengagement. The employee had interpreted silence as support. Neither assumption was true. One honest conversation completely changed their relationship. Sometimes accountability means raising expectations. Sometimes accountability means offering support. You can't know which one someone needs until you ask. That's why I tell leaders to start with observable facts instead of assumptions. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's the impact. Help me understand what's going on. Those 4 sentences have saved more working relationships than almost any leadership technique I have ever taught. Hard conversations aren't acts of criticism. They're acts of care. So let's switch gears for a minute because I also want to talk about something that it creates incredible burnout inside nonprofits: fundraising. You know what's interesting? Most organizations don't actually have a fundraising problem. They have a fundraising systems problem. Here's what I mean. I'll ask an executive director, "So how's fundraising going?" And they'll say, "We're exhausted." That's not a fundraising metric. That's a lifestyle. Then I'll ask, "Tell me about your revenue development plan." Silence. Or someone reaches over to a bookshelf, pulls out a 3-inch binder, blows the dust off, and says, "Well, we have this." Friends, a binder is not a fundraising strategy. A development plan should be alive. It should guide your work every single week. It should answer questions like, who are we talking to this month? Who are we thanking? Who needs another touch point? Where are our major gift opportunities? How are board members involved? What stories are we collecting? Because fundraising isn't about asking for money, it's about building relationships. And relationships aren't built in emergencies. They're built consistently. One conversation at a time. One thank you note at a time. One coffee meeting at a time. One handwritten card at a time. That's what sustainable revenue looks like. So, can we talk about boards for just a minute? I love boards. I really do. I've served on them. I've chaired them. I've trained hundreds of them. I've staffed them. I've also seen boards accidentally create stress they never intended. Usually it starts with good intentions. Someone wants to help. Someone has an idea. Someone reads an article on LinkedIn, and suddenly the executive director has 12 new assignments by Tuesday. Sound familiar? One of the healthiest governance shifts I ever see is when a board truly understands its lane. Governance asks, are we moving towards the mission? Management asks, how are we going to get there? Those are different questions. One board I worked with had committee meetings because, well, they'd always had committee meetings. Nobody could explain why. There were committees with no work, committees that hadn't met in months, committees that duplicated each other. We finally asked if we were building this organization today, would we create these committees? The answer was no. So we redesigned committee structure around strategy instead of tradition. Within 6 months, meetings were shorter, board engagement increased, staff interruptions decreased, hooray. Nothing magical happened. People simply became clear about who owned what and why. Ownership grows when everyone understands their role. Now, I want to talk about the danger of the hero. One of the biggest burnout risks that I see is the hero. And I think you know exactly who I'm talking about at your organization. It's the employee who knows everything, the executive director who has every donor relationship, the board chair who remembers every decision from the last 15 years, which also tells me you don't have term limits, but that's another podcast. The finance manager who knows where every spreadsheet lives. They're amazing until they take a vacation or retire or move away or simply decide they're done. I've watched organizations lose decades of institutional knowledge because everything lived inside one person's head. That isn't sustainable. It's also unfair. Real leadership isn't about becoming indispensable. It's about making yourself replaceable. I know that sounds backwards, but it's true. The strongest leaders build systems that allow other people to succeed. That means documenting processes, cross-training staff, sharing donor relationships, developing future leaders. Succession planning isn't planning for someone's departure. It's planning for organizational stability. That's an act of stewardship. So one of my favorite sayings is this: culture isn't your values painted on the conference room wall. Culture is what happens on a Tuesday afternoon where everything goes sideways. That's when you discover who you really are. Do people blame each other or solve the problem? Do they hide mistakes or learn from them? Do leaders panic or do they create calm? Those little moments become culture, not your strategic plan, not your mission statement, not the beautiful words framed in your lobby. Culture is built one conversation, one meeting, one decision, one follow-through at a time. That's why consistency matters so much. People don't need perfect leaders. They need predictable leaders, leaders whose actions match their words. So I'll leave you with one final story today. Not long ago, I received a call from an executive director who opened our conversation by saying, "Kari, I think everything is broken." I laughed, not because I was making light of her situation, but because I've heard that sentence more times than I can count. Part of the time I broke it. So I asked, "Tell me what's happening." She started listing everything: the board, fundraising, staff morale, communication, volunteer issues, budget concerns, strategic planning. She talked for almost 15 minutes without taking a breath. Finally, I said, "Can I tell you what I heard?" She said yes. I said, "I don't think you have 12 problems. I think you have about 3. Silence. Then she laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from relief. Sometimes we become so close to our work that every loose thread looks like a separate crisis. An outside perspective helps you see the pattern. That's why I love the work I get to do. I don't show up pretending to have all the answers. I show up asking good questions, helping people untangle knots, helping boards and staff hear each other again, helping leaders breathe again. Because healthy nonprofits don't happen by accident. They're built. One conversation, one system, one decision, one relationship at a time. So before our time together ends today, I want to leave you with 3 small challenges. First, write down your top 3 organizational priorities for the next 30 days. Then, share them with your team. Repeat them often. Protect them fiercely. Second, choose one position on your team and write a simple 1-page description of what success looks like. Not a job description, a success description. Give that person something clear to own. And third, have one conversation you've been avoiding. Be respectful. Be curious. Be specific. Don't wait another 8 months. Leadership isn't about carrying everything yourself. It's about creating an environment where other people can carry the mission with you. That's ownership. And that's how burnout begins to lose its grip. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If today's episode resonated with you, I'd love for you to share it with another nonprofit leader who might need to hear it. And if your organization feels tangled right now, whether it's your board, your team, your fundraising, your strategy, know this: you are not alone. Sometimes one good conversation is all it takes to start moving from burnout to ownership. Until next time, keep building and keep building organizations that are as healthy on the inside as the missions they serve on the outside. Be sure to find me on your favorite streaming platforms, and for more tips and tools, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at inciteconsultinggroup.com. I'm Kari Anderson, and this has been Kari's Confessions, a nonprofit exec tells all. I'll see you next week.